Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia Augmented Brass tutorial series. Today we're going to take our first of two looks at the modulation sections. It's a little bit too much to cover in a single episode. Today I want to cover the filters in the bottom part of the layers page, and also we'll have a look at the low frequency oscillator options. If you're enjoying this series so far and you'd like to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. It's an awesome way to do it. For today's purposes, we're just going to use layer A part 1. I've disabled layer B, and the filter is currently on. And when I pull the cutoff down, you can see in the spectrum analyzer and here all of those high frequencies being thrown away. So at the moment that's operating in low pass filter mode. This button down at the bottom of the page is telling you that this is a low pass filter. If we flip over to a high pass filter, the opposite is going to happen. At the upper end of the cutoff range, we're not hearing any sound because basically all of the low frequencies are thrown away up to 20 kilohertz, which basically means we're hearing nothing. And there they are back. But this time, somewhere in the middle, we're throwing away those lower frequencies. We have a notch filter, which is going to scoop a range of frequencies out of the curve, you can see. And our resonance is going to allow us to manipulate the shape of that scoop. You can see it flattening out and then getting deeper again. The band pass filter, we let frequencies around the cutoff frequency, which is about here, get through, and everything else gets thrown away. And as we increase resonance, that spike gets higher and higher as we accentuate the frequencies around the cutoff. All of this is really straightforward stuff. Pretty much every filter you'll ever see has all of these options. Get back to a low pass filter. The filter has its own envelope. It can be a little bit unintuitive as to what's going on unless you turn the sustain all the way down. I'll show you why in a moment, but sustain can be a bit of a misleading control with this filter. The effect that I want to achieve with this envelope is to have the filter come in, basically bring the upper frequencies in and then take them back out again over a period of time. So that's my challenge. I need to accomplish that. First of all, I'm going to get myself a decent basic filter sound going. Okay, so that's my static sound that I want to end up with, start off and end up with, but I want to go on a journey through the envelope. So now I'm going to introduce some attack and some decay. Watch what happens when I introduce this envelope into the filter. So I'm going to set it at maximum, brighter, all the way up to maximum. Then the decay kicks in. We pull all of those frequencies away and we end up back where we started, as if we didn't have an envelope in the first place. So your attack and your decay, basically like a manual, turning the cutoff up and then turning it back down again. With that information in mind, now we introduce the element of sustain, which is basically a shelf, a higher shelf, by which this cutoff is going to be permanently boosted. So we'll go through that envelope again, up, hit the maximum, and then come back down again through the decay phase. Now I'm going to introduce an element of sustain. There you can see, as I turn the sustain knob up, it's basically increasing the cutoff value. So all of these controls in the envelope are like virtual additions to this cutoff value. If you want to introduce sustain, you're highly likely to want to turn the cutoff down very low because the sustain knob is taking care of your cutoff increase. Let's see what this sounds like. So now we started off very low. We went through the frequency curve. We've still got some decay. There's the decay bringing us back. And now we've settled out somewhere in the middle of the frequency range, primarily generated by this sustain value. Let's turn the envelope back off again. Got different kinds of filters to play with. Multimode is your standard Arturia filter. SEM is a variant thereof. They're very similar. and we don't need to concentrate too much on the differences between them. It's basically different circuitry, different emulated circuitry. So SEM is a classic analog synthesizer from the early 1970s. Just has a slightly different tonal characteristic. You can see it in the analyzer when I switch to multi-mode. They sound different. Surgeon is a very steep, almost brick wall filter. Applies this exceptionally steep filter cutoff. If you want to be really like laser targeted with throwing upper or lower frequencies away. Comb filters apply a second version of the wave, slightly offset in time. So by basically replicating the wave and offsetting them very slightly, a tiny delay, you generate constructive and destructive interference. We also have a feedback loop in this filter, which is going to allow us to create quite sharp, there we go. The filter's feeding back now, so the signal is coming back on itself, and the gain is controlling the strength of that copied signal. So the more gain that you send back into the feedback circuit, the more you're going to get that the feedback effect. So the comb filter is probably the most effect-laden, most dramatic sounding of the filters. And feedback and feed forward simply determine where in this feedback loop, whether or not the copied signal is sent back into the filter circuit or whether it's forwarded on to the output. It's basically just a different kind of processing of the two filters. Use your ears to hear between the two different types. There's feedback with a really obvious feedback effect. Whereas feed forward, because the copy is being sent directly to the output, we don't get that feedback effect, but we do get the comb filtering. See all of these spikes in the frequency curve. That's basically, it looks like the teeth of a comb. That's why it's called a comb filter. It's unusual to see the option for a phaser in a filter circuit, but basically a phaser is a kind of filter. But in order for you to hear what you would expect, like the classical phaser sound, there needs to be modulation in the system. At the moment, this is a static phaser, which is an unusual combination of terms. If I press a key, so you can see that sections of the frequency curve are being sculpted out. That's what a phaser does. It uses a curious thing called phase inversion via the use of all-pass filters. Don't really need to get into the science of how it's done, but individual sections of the frequency curve are phase inverted, and that results in these cutouts of sound. So you can see these two different zones where parts of the frequency curve are being cancelled out. If I switch to a 6-pole filter, you'll get 3 cutouts. 1, 2, 3. And an 8-pole filter has 4 cutouts. I think there's 1 there. 2, 3, 4. But where you really get the classic phaser effect is when you adjust these cutoff points. And I want you to take note of that because we'll be using that control when we have a look at modulation. Finally, the formant section allows you to emulate voices, human voices. So this is generating vowel sounds. So a couple of these options are really dramatic. They have a very violent effect on the sound. Let's get back to more comfortable territory, back to our low pass filter. Now I want to start modulating this filter, and this is where part 2 of the episode comes in, where we need to look at the modulation screen. So a low frequency oscillator is a wave that does this thing. Let's control its speed, slow it down a little bit. So at the moment, this low frequency oscillator isn't doing anything. We've just got this free oscillator available for our use, cycling at very low frequencies. So it's a low frequency oscillator. We're going to attach that low frequency oscillator to the filter circuit to vary this cutoff dynamically. If you hover over the control, a little plus symbol appears. That's how you map modulation. Click the plus symbol. And now the modulation display at the bottom of the screen changes. It says, well, what do you want to map to this filter cutoff? Well, I want to map low frequency oscillator 1. So all I do is click in the box, drag up with my mouse, and now I'm applying this much modulation to the filter cutoff. Can you also see this purple band that appears? That's the maximum and minimum ranges of the low frequency oscillator. If I move my mouse to somewhere else, you can now see that low frequency oscillator cycling in the background. So now when I press a key, that sine wave is periodically changing the cutoff value. If I press X, I'm not deleting the modulation, I'm simply closing down the editor. So that modulation is still there. You can see now this little purple symbol cycling in the background. Let's get it back again. If you modulate a control past its maximum extent, see how when I get to about 0.38, the upper purple marker is reaching the limit. There's nothing else for it to do. If I push that low frequency oscillator past, all it's going to do is get to the maximum. The low frequency oscillator will still kind of keep going in the background, and for a period of time it'll basically max out, and you'll hear this stable signal until it sweeps back around. It's a bit like it passes into eclipse, and you have to wait for a period of time before it comes back again. Let's jump back over to the modulation page and have a look at it from that perspective, because now you can see filter A cutoff is assigned in the main viewer, so you can see it from either the layers perspective or the modulation screen perspective. If I turn off this filter, then that effect will no longer apply. There are two different low frequency oscillators, but they're essentially identical, simply capable of being mapped to different destinations. Each modulation source in Augmented Brass is capable of being assigned to 4 different places. So let's assign this low frequency oscillator somewhere else. Jump back over to the layer, and we'll assign it to the resonance as well. So we click our little plus button, drag up on low frequency oscillator, and that's now set. And you can see that these two low frequency oscillators are doing different jobs. They're oscillating around different center points, and they're also working at different rates. So if we click in LFO 1, you can see that the filter A cutoff is being affected more, 0.36, than the resonance at 0.24. Because there are so many different perspectives that we're looking at this stuff, I'm just going to close that down and do it again just to absolutely clarify what's going on. So here's my main viewer. I've not got any filter options selected at all. This time I single click on the low frequency oscillator itself, which brings up the dedicated, these are the mappings for the low frequency oscillator. In this view, I can now pick up the little purple bars and click and drag and manipulate them. Still got control over the center point as well, but if I click in the outer ring, you see the arrow turns to this, the mouse turns to the up and down arrow, and I can control the amount. So there's basically 3 different perspectives that you can have. You can click on the low frequency oscillator from the main panel to see an overview of its controls. You can click on an individual controls plus button to see a total reading of all of the modulation sources that can possibly be mapped to this thing. Or you can jump over to the modulation page and see the world from its perspective, and now you can see what it's mapped to. So what does that sound like? Speed it up. Slow it down. Let's change the shape. Triangles, saws, ramps, square. If we make a very fast square, sample and hold is an unusual one. We don't have lines with sample and hold because it's basically choosing a random value every period of time specified by the rate and then jumping to that new random value. Very good at higher frequencies. Get back to the sine wave. And the demonstration so far has used a free running low frequency oscillator. Can you see it cycling in the background? It doesn't matter whether I press any keys, it's still doing its thing. If I engage key trigger mode, however, at the moment it looks like I haven't had any effect, but the moment I press a key, it jumps back to the beginning. And every key that I press does exactly the same thing. So each one of those keys, I've just pressed 6 notes on the keyboard, they all had individual low frequency oscillators, all doing different things to that note's individual filter options. Now that's not necessarily what you want. You might want everything to basically jump onto one single low frequency oscillator and all of the notes of the chord that you play follow the single same route. Well, you can do that. Just basically disengage polyphonic. So by default, the low frequency oscillator is polyphonic and responds to every single key uniquely. But now that we've disengaged that feature, they'll all use the same low frequency oscillator. They'll still trigger, but when I play multiple notes, only the first note pressed triggered the restart of the low frequency oscillator. All subsequent notes basically jumped onto that bandwagon. The setting just to the left of polyphonic is called unipolar. Have a look in the main output. You see this line basically telling you that the wave is both positive and negative. If I engage unipolar mode, that's no longer the case. Now all of the modulation is going to be positive. Let's jump over to the layer page to see what effect that's had. And now you can see, here's our center point, but all of the modulation is occurring in the positive territory. So if I adjust the center point of the dial, now that you can see that more clearly. So now that I've adjusted the cutoff knob, the effect is going to sound basically the same because I've moved the cutoff to compensate for the fact that the low frequency oscillator is unipolar in the cutoff range. But of course, resonance has been affected as well. So we've got a different resonance range that we're operating on here. The cutoff is effectively the same, but the resonance modulation range has changed. One final option to look at in this row of controls is the envelope mode. So now the low frequency oscillator is waiting for a key to be pressed. When it is, that low frequency oscillator will operate as if it's an envelope. In other words, it'll do its thing once and then it'll stop. And obviously, because we're still in monophonic mode, all of those subsequent keys that I pressed didn't re-trigger the low frequency oscillator. I'll do the same thing again. Each one of those notes has its own envelope. Once the envelope's completed its journey for any individual note, there's nothing more for it to do. And there, everything is now static and there's no more filter modulation being applied. Phase allows us to move this wave forwards and backwards in time. So do we want to start at the top of the curve or the bottom of the curve? And for something like a sawtooth, you can get quite dramatic changes where you get 2 mini sawtooths for the price of 1. And finally, amplitude is the overall master amount that this low frequency oscillator can possibly have any impact on the system. So if I turn this down, now the modulation, I'm operating at these levels. These are all relative levels. I've just turned the overall low frequency oscillator down. So it's having a much gentler effect on the filter. So that's basically like a master volume control if you want to treat it in those kind of crude terms. And remember earlier when we were looking at the phaser, I said just remember these controls because we'll come back to them. I'm going to click in the LFO viewer and I'm going to remove, this is the easiest way to remove multiple modulations at once. I'm going to change the filter type to phaser, dial in a nice basic filter cutoff sound. Now let's remap this cutoff. want a sine wave. A bit faster. So that's how you build a phaser. You apply a low frequency oscillator to a static filter. It's a very roundabout way of going about it, but that's an example of how to implement a phaser. Let's get rid of that and head back into the modulation page. Finally, down at the bottom of the page, we've got dedicated controls for vibrato and tremolo, and these are really standard. They're hardwired to the keyboard. We don't have to map anything. So let's press a note. Got no other modulation going on at the moment. There's the vibrato. But I might not want it on all the time. Let's turn it back off again. And what I want to do this time is have the vibrato come in when I press into the aftertouch. So I want to see all of my modulation sources. Here is aftertouch. So if I click in the aftertouch section, now I can directly go to the outer ring of depth, pick it up, move it, and now aftertouch is going to control the depth of vibrato. So here's me pressing a key, here's me pressing into the aftertouch, and you can see in the visual display me pressing into the aftertouch and then releasing. So that's how simple it is to assign different kinds of modulation to different levels of control. Let's say I wanted to assign the modulation wheel to the vibrato rate. Close it down. Here's my modulation wheel. Here's my rate outer ring. So let's get it up and running. And I'll press in so that we've got some aftertouch. Now I'll introduce the modulation wheel. And there's me speeding the vibrato up. And I'm just pulling the modulation wheel back down, as you can see in the viewer, controlling the vibrato rate. So probably the most difficult thing to get your head around is the number of different perspectives that you have on all of these different modulation controls, and they all look and behave slightly differently depending on which angle you're looking at them from. Vibrato is all about varying pitch over time. Tremolo is all about varying volume over time. The one control I've not explicitly talked about today is fade. For the LFOs, it's a little bit difficult to demonstrate because in standard LFO mode, it doesn't do anything. If you're on key trigger mode, however, every time you press a key, you're going to get a fade in of the modulation amount. It's actually easier for me to demonstrate on the tremolo since we're looking there at the moment. If I press a key, that tremolo kicks off immediately. If I introduce a couple of seconds of fade, just make the effect more dramatic. We start off with no tremolo and then it's introduced over the fade-in period. Same concept for the LFO, but you need to be in key trigger mode to hear it. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.